This man murdered over 20 women within a 5-year period. Despite being interviewed by police over 9 times, it took one of the most expensive manhunts in the UK to finally catch him. Dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper, he believed he was on a mission from God to murder women. My name's Emma, this is Tiki Bar True Crimes, and I'd like to tell you the story of the Yorkshire Ripper. Peter Sutcliffe was born in 1946 in Yorkshire to father John and mother Kathleen. Peter and his siblings were all raised as Catholics. John, his father, was an alcoholic who raged terror on his family. His siblings later described him as a monster. One Christmas, when Peter was just 5 years old, John smashed a glass over his head because he sat in the wrong seat. John would whip his children with belts and insult Peter regularly for his skinny and slight appearance. Peter's slim frame caused him to be terribly bullied at school as well. John also teased Peter for being a mummy's boy. Peter doted on his mother, and his mother doted on Peter. Peter saw his mother as perfect for many years, until his father would go out of his way to undo the only trusting and loving relationship Peter ever had. He pretended to be Kathleen's lover and arranged to meet her in a hotel. He dragged their children with him, and when confronted, Kathleen forced her to pull out her underwear from her handbag. Showing that Kathleen was having an affair, this destroyed Peter's perfect image of his mother. John later said that, "I remember Peter was just standing there. He was shook rigid. He had a look on his face like an animal. It may have turned his mind." Peter left school early and got a job as a gravedigger. Co-workers would later say that he loved this job too much. He would willingly do overtime, which meant preparing and washing the bodies of the corpses, which he seemed to kind of delight in. As a teenager, Peter began to spy on sex workers. He had an obsession and fascination with voyeurism. Some speculate that as he grew up, he began to hire prostitutes himself. In 1967, aged 21, he met 16-year-old Sonia Sussman. They began dating, and 7 years later, they got married. Sonia was actually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Sonia was very domineering over Peter and treated him as though he was a naughty schoolboy. She also had bizarre, unprovoked outbursts of rage where Peter has to physically restrain her in order for him not to get hurt. Sonia suffered several miscarriages and the couple never had children. Later, a journalist who interviewed Sonia described her as the most irritating, strangest and coldest person I've ever met. She's so incredibly prickly and demanding. In 1969, aged 23, Peter Sutcliffe is out drinking with his friend Trevor Birdsall. A young woman tricks him out of money. He goes off searching for her and comes across a female sex worker. He stalks her for a while and follows her into a garage, where he strikes her over the head with a stone. He goes running back to Trevor and says, "Quick, get in the van, let's go." The sex worker manages to note down the vehicle registration number, and the police arrive at Peter's house the next day. Luckily for Peter, the woman doesn't want to press charges. So Peter has gone out, attacked a woman, and basically gotten away with it, even though the police know that it happened. I think this starts to plant the seed in Peter's head that perhaps he can get away with some of his more perverted fantasies. 6 years on, in 1975, 36-year-old Anna Rogolski is walking home from a night out. She's planning to see her boyfriend when a man calls out to her if she fancies it. She retorts, "Not on your life," and quickens her pace. She arrives at her boyfriend's house and is screaming, smashing on the front door, and even actually hurls her shoe through the ground window, smashing it. Her boyfriend is clearly passed out. He doesn't answer, so Anna quickly heads on to get home. By this point, Anna is panicking and she hears the man's voice again before being struck over the head with a hammer. Peter then lifts up her blouse and begins stabbing her in the stomach. This is clearly a premeditated attack, as who walks down the road with a hammer and a knife? Even though Peter's aim was to murder Anna, a neighbour heard the commotion and ran out to see what was going on. Startled, Peter fled and Anna survived. However, she says she's so traumatized by the attack, she often wishes that she was murdered. She says her life is a misery. She's often afraid to even go out of the house. 1 month later, 46-year-old Olive Smelt is out with friends at a pub. She's laughing and having fun, and Peter is there with his friend Trevor. Peter says that Olive annoyed him. He thought she was a sex worker. He even said to her face that she was on the game. Olive made a smart retort that she wasn't, and this annoyed Peter further. At the end of the night, Olive's friends drop her off at a lay-by. It's a very short walk from her home, and she's hoping to grab some fish and chips for her and her husband. At the same time, Peter and Trevor are making their way home. Peter's driving and he spots Olive. He pulls over and says to Trevor that he just needs to talk to someone. He gets out of the car and starts following her. He comments to her about how it's bad weather. It's heavily raining at the time. She ignores him and then he strikes her over the head with a hammer, lifts up her blouse and begins to slash her lower back. Suddenly, a car with headlights approaches and once again Peter freaks out and flees. Olive survives, and akin to Anna before, she is traumatized by these events. She suffers severe emotional and mental trauma for the rest of her life. Peter returns to the car and Trevor said that he's very calm, very quiet, nothing suspicious. However, when he reads the paper the next day and sees the attack on Olive, he has his suspicions but never reports anything. 12 days later, 14-year-old Tracy Brown is making her way home. It's late and a man catches up with her and begins to make some small talk. She says she found him charming and actually felt no danger towards this man. He would occasionally stop to tie his shoelace or blow his nose. They reached the gate to her family's farm when Peter suddenly struck her 5 times over the head. Every time he struck her, Tracy would make this awful grunting sound and would be begging him to stop. Disturbed again by a car approaching, Peter hurled her body and chucked it over the fence so that it was out of sight. He then completely fled the scene, whilst Tracy stumbled back home covered in blood. She subsequently spent 4 hours in surgery with life-threatening injuries. In the October of that year, 28-year-old Wilma McCann kisses her 4 children goodnight. She leaves her eldest 9-year-old son in charge. She's a survivor. They don't have much money and she'll do anything to get food on the table, including sex work. So she goes out for the evening and begins drinking. She eventually leaves the club at 1 a.m. She's drunk and she's staggering around the road. She actually manages to flag down a lorry and they do pull over. However, she's so drunk, she's hurling abuse at them and giving incoherent instructions that this man just drives away. Peter at the same time is driving around these streets looking for a victim and he spots Wilma. She gets into his car and asks if he wants business. Peter is confused. He genuinely doesn't know what she means. To which Wilma retorts, "Bloody hell, do I have to spell it out for you?" Peter then drives them to a field just yards away from Wilma's home. They get out and she asks for a $5 in return for sexual favours. She taunts him slightly and tells him to just get on with it. Peter retorts, "Don't worry, I will." before striking her over the head with a hammer. He stabs her in the throat, the breasts, and 9 times over the stomach. Wilma was Peter's first victim to be murdered. At just 28 years old, she left behind 4 children. The eldest daughter subsequently took her own life after years of depression and trauma surrounding her mother's murder and the consequences that brought to her and her siblings. Wilma was found the next day by a milkman and his son. Forensic analysis showed that these weren't normal stab wounds. This person had plunged the instrument fully into Wilma's body, turned it slightly, and then released, before kind of admiring it and doing it again. It's at this point that the experts realise that they are dealing with someone who's very disturbed. The sad thing about Vilma McCann is that because she was a sex worker and the attitudes at the time, this was seen as basically a fish and chip shop murder. And if you're not from the UK, that basically means that it's in the papers one day and then the next day it's used to wrap up someone's fish and chips. People didn't have a lot of sympathy for sex workers at the time, and so it didn't really stay in the news. Wilma was also found very near Chapel Town, and this is where this case kind of centres. This is a poverty-stricken area of Leeds. There is 21% unemployment. There's a large community of African Americans who are victimised themselves by police, so are very unwilling to help with any investigations. There's also a very large number of prostitutes. January of 1976, 42-year-old Emily Jackson has headed into town with her husband looking for sex work. They have fallen on hard financial times. Her husband is close to being declared bankrupt and they need money for their family. It's actually her husband who suggested that she goes into prostitution. She leaves her husband in a pub and goes out looking for work when she bumps into Peter Sutcliffe. She gets into his car and they drive off to a derelict area. Peter later said that her cheap perfume infuriated him. Not only did it infuriate him, it made him unable to perform. When arriving at this derelict area, they vacate the car and Peter strikes her over the head. He also stabs her over 50 times with a screwdriver. At this point, he is just seething with hate and finds a piece of wood laying in this yard and shoves it between her legs. Meanwhile, Emily's husband looks for her, but decides that perhaps she's with a client and heads home. In the morning, Emily Jackson is discovered down an alleyway. Peter Sutcliffe has displayed her corpse in such a way as to humiliate her. Her legs have been splayed apart, and anyone coming down that alleyway would have seen her exposed. They also noticed that there is a boot print on her right thigh. So after murdering her, Peter stamps hard on her leg. This is just another example of how Peter wants to show his disgust at these women. The size of the boot impression is a 7, and in the UK that's very small for a man. I'm a size 7 myself. So this was quite a good lead for the police. A fellow sex worker said that she saw Emily get into a Land Rover. This sighting of the Land Rover is also found in other cases, and although it's not Peter Sutcliffe, this was probably the last client that Emily Jackson had before meeting Peter. The identity of the owner of this Land Rover is never known. 5 months later, in May 1976, Marcella Claxon is walking home when she accepts a lift from Peter. Now, there are 2 versions of the event. Marcella says that she got out to pee, and Peter says that she got out to pee, but also she offered sexual favours. Marcella said she never offered Peter sex at all. Either way, she did get out, and when she got out and was crouched down, Peter struck her over the head several times with a hammer before fleeing. Marcella Claxon managed to stagger her way to a nearby phone box and call for help. She later stated that after I dialed 999 and was sat on the floor of the telephone box, a man in a white car kept driving past. He seemed to be staring and looking for me. It was the man that hurt me. He got out and began searching the spot where he left me. He must have come back to finish me off. Despite her appalling injuries, she did actually manage to give a fairly accurate description of Peter Sutcliffe. And although Marcella survived, unfortunately her unborn child did not, and she miscarried shortly after. She also suffered from blackouts and chronic depression for the rest of her life. After this failed attempt, it's nearly almost a whole year before Peter strikes again. 28-year-old Irene Richardson has fallen on hard times. She's homeless, she has no money, and she turns to sex work. She gets picked up by Peter one evening and promises him a good time. He takes her to the same field that he took Marcella. She gets out to pee and he proceeds to strike her over the back of the head again before stabbing her multiple times in the stomach. Once she is dead, he proceeds to mutilate her body in such a way that her intestines end up coming out. Just 2 months later, he also murders Patricia Atkinson's, a 32-year-old sex worker, in a very similar fashion. So we begin to see this pattern of he murders them using a hammer and a knife or a screwdriver. He then mutilates the body somehow to show his disgust and displays them in a humiliating way. The police begin to realise that they have a serial killer on the loose, and the public start to become worried, even more so with his next victim. In 1977, 16-year-old Jane McDonald, who isn't a sex worker, is out with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend was walking her home when she said she'd get a taxi the rest of the way. She went to call the one, but she couldn't get through, so she decided it was a very short walk and she would just walk home. On her way home, Peter spotted her and convinced himself that she was a sex worker. He followed her briefly before striking her over the back of the head. Lying face down, he dragged her into a play area. He said her shoes made an awful scraping sound. He hit her again with a hammer and proceeded to stab her several times over her torso. He also smashed a glass bottle and embedded it into her chest. The next morning, her body is discovered by children going to play in that park. The murder of Jane McDonald truly shocked the public. She was seen as innocent, and it shows the kind of attitudes towards sex workers at the time. This frightened the public, and we begin to see a real stir and panic. Now, Peter before had preyed on sex workers and it had kind of gone unnoticed. People just unfortunately didn't care as much. We can see this in other cases where perpetrators prey on marginalised groups, for example, gay people, or even today, the Long Island serial killer, he preyed on sex workers as well and went for decades not being caught. There's this idea in the 70s, and arguably still slightly now, that sex workers are lesser people. They deserve it. It's not as shocking if one of them gets murdered. Peter himself was shocked the next day when he read in the paper that Jane wasn't a sex worker. He said, "The next one I did still feel terrible about. It was the young girl Jane McDonald. I read recently about her father dying of a broken heart, and it brought it all back to me. I realised what sort of monster I had become." Jane's father, Will McDonald, did die 2 years later, never recovering or getting over the murder of his daughter Jane. October 1977, 20-year-old Jean Jordan, a sex worker, is out looking for work. She gets picked up by Peter, who takes her to a cemetery where he proceeds to murder her in his now trademark Ripper fashion. He flees the scene, and when he leaves, he suddenly realises that he left a £5 note there. Now, this £5 note was new, and it was given to him in a pay packet just 2 days earlier. He realises that this is traceable. He has a decision: either return to the crime scene, which is busy, there are people driving past this cemetery quite a lot, or just leave it. He decides to leave it, thinking he would hear about the murder the next day. Morning rolls around and there's no news. The next day rolls around, again there's still no news. A week later, and no reports have been made of the murder of Jean Jordan. Peter decides that after hosting a family party, he would drop his parents back home and on the way back make a detour to Jean Jordan's corpse to retrieve this £5 note. Arriving, he began to search for it, but to no avail. He even picked up her decaying body and looked underneath. Nothing. Anger began to flood him, and he began attacking Jean's lifeless body again, stabbing and slashing with pure rage. The stench when her stomach blew open caused him to vomit, but he continued to attack the body. He even used a large piece of glass, deciding to horribly mutilate the body in a way not associated with previous Ripper killings. He tried to cut her head off and leave it somewhere else. He eventually gave up on that plan. He kicked the body a few more times, and frustrated and figuring out he had been at the scene long enough and was pushing his luck by staying there any longer, he finally gave up. He got into his car and he began to head home. 8 days after Jean is murdered, her body is discovered, and when police are looking at the scene, they find her handbag. Inside a hidden compartment in that bag is the £5 note. The police are excited because they are able to trace this, and they do. They narrow it down to 8,000 employees. 5,000 of those are men. They end up interviewing every single one, including Sutcliffe. But where he seemingly has such a strong alibi for the night where the perpetrator returned, remember he was hosting a family dinner, he was ruled out. This all leaves the police frustrated. They think they had a clue to get them to their attacker, but it kind of all fell through. They couldn't link this vital clue to anyone. January 1978, Yvonne Pearson kissed her 2 kids goodnight and went out looking for work. Peter at the time was helping his family move home. Afterwards, they offered him a drink. Peter declined, saying he needed to get back to his wife Sonia. That's not what he did. He drove around the streets of Leeds looking for his next victim. He nearly gets into a car crash and emergency brakes when a young blonde woman taps on his window, offering him a good time. Yvonne gets into the car and off they go. Peter drives them to somewhere quiet, and on exiting the car, he bludgeons Yvonne over the head. Suddenly though, a car pulls up next to them. He grabs his victim and begins shoving horsehair from a sofa down her throat in order to stop her making any noise. He is panicking. This person is right there. Yvonne is still alive and making noises. He is grabbing handfuls and clumps of horsehair and shoving it into this poor woman's mouth. At the same time, he is holding her nose. What felt like hours, this car suddenly drives away. Peter now has the lifeless body of Yvonne Pearson. He proceeds to undress her and jump up and down on her chest. With his full weight, he is pounding up and down on this poor woman's lifeless body. He then covers her with some soil, chucks an old sofa over her, and leaves. This just shows the absolute disgust and contempt he had for sex workers and women in general. This poor woman's last seconds of life were so horrific, and for her body to be treated in such a way is just disgusting. Her body wasn't discovered for 2 months. How? People aren't so sure. So a dog walker was walking by and saw her arm poking out of the sofa. People thought maybe Peter had returned to the crime scene and maybe moved the body again. He denies this. Unless her arm was moved by an animal, it seems weird that no one noticed it before. Just 10 days after he murders Yvonne, so her body isn't even discovered yet, he goes out and murders another sex worker. This time it's 18-year-old Elena Riker. She is the Ripper's 8th murder victim. He kills her in the traditional Ripper style, and he later states that by this point, he had an urge to kill any woman. The urge inside me to kill girls was now practically uncontrollable. He went on a few months later to murder Vera Millwood, a 40-year-old sex worker. Again, he did this in the traditional Ripper fashion. It's April 1979 and 19-year-old clerk Josephine Whittaker is walking home from her grandparents' house. They had offered that she stayed over, but she had work the next day and had forgotten her contact lenses, so insisted on going home. Peter had been out drinking with his friend Trevor. He dropped Trevor off home and began to drive around the streets of Leeds looking for his next victim. He saw Josephine pulled over and began to follow her. Catching up with her, he made some small talk. She mentioned that she was walking home and it was quite far, but she was going to take a shortcut across the fields. Peter remarked that she's very brave, as you don't know who could be out. As they made their way across the field, Peter walked with her. They made small talk. He asked her what the time was, and she told the time by looking at the local clock tower. He paused while she walked on and complimented her on her great eyesight as how she could see that from such a distance. He then ran up and struck her over the back of the head with a hammer. However, a couple were now approaching, taking the same shortcut as them over the fields. He dragged Josephine's body while she was still moaning into the darkness, hoping that they would go unnoticed. The couple walked on by, however, the man later said that he did hear a noise, and it was the kind of noise that made your hair stand up on end. Once they left, Peter began to stab Josephine over 20 times with a screwdriver. Once dead, he splayed her legs and rammed the screwdriver into her vagina. He also fractured her skull from ear to ear. Her body was discovered the next morning, and with lots of police around, Josephine's brother, after finishing his newspaper round, returned across those same playing fields. He saw the shoe and recognised it as one of his sisters. He ran home as fast as he could to tell his stepfather and mother. They raced into Josephine's bedroom, hoping she was there. On finding it empty, they were distraught with fear and grief. They called the police, who later confirmed it was their little girl. There was forensic evidence left at the scene. However, at the same time, we have this hoax that takes place. A man claiming to be the Ripper contacts the police via letter and voicemail. This man has a different accent and basically leads the police down completely the wrong path and wastes their time. It wasn't until 2005 that this hoaxer was identified as an unemployed alcoholic, John Humble. He received 8 years in prison for perverting the cause of justice. In 1979, 20-year-old Barbara Leach is a university student and she's making her way home when she is attacked by Peter. This shocks the public. Again, Barbara is not a sex worker, she's a university student. People begin to think that basically the devil's on the loose. The police are never going to catch him, and people are scared, particularly women are petrified at this point. A huge push was made to try and find the Ripper, but despite Sutcliffe being interviewed and matching with the £5 note, he was never really a suspect. 6 months later, in April 1980, Peter Sutcliffe is actually arrested for drunk driving. Whilst awaiting trial, he goes out and murders again. This time it's a 47-year-old civil servant, Marge Walls. She leaves the office around 10 p.m. and the Ripper follows her before smashing her over the head, yelling, "You filthy prostitute." He then tied some rope around her neck whilst kneeling on her chest and begins to choke her. Once dead, he removed all of her clothes except for her tights and dragged her into a secluded area of a high-walled garden and covered her with some grass. His final victim was 20-year-old Jacqueline Hill. She was a student who was murdered going back to her halls. He killed her in the traditional Ripper-style fashion, but also stabbed her with a screwdriver in the eyes. Peter Sutcliffe ends up being arrested for murder on basically luck and a hunch. They catch him with a 24-year-old prostitute and bring him in for questioning. The police officer that arrested him is uneasy, has a funny feeling, so decides to return to the scene, where he finds a knife, a hammer, and some rope that's been hidden in an old oil drum. Peter also manages to carry a knife to the police station and hides it in one of their toilets. His outfit as well is bizarre. He's wearing a V-neck jumper but over his legs. So the sleeves go over his legs and the bottom of the jumper is kind of up near his chest. Now the V-neck means that his genitals are exposed. Also, the elbows of this jumper have padded bits, which would therefore sit where his knees were. This is really suspicious, as the Ripper would often kneel over his victims, so those padded bits at his knees would prove quite handy. He was arrested and charged and declared the Ripper. Over the next few weeks, he told police that he was on a mission from God. God told him to murder women, and particularly sex workers. He was basically clearing up litter from off the streets. That's how he saw it. He said he was given this mission from God when he was a gravedigger as a young boy, and whilst tending to one of the graves of a Polish man, God came through to him and asked him to complete this task. At trial in 1981, he pled not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter on diminished responsibility because he was hearing these voices. Sutcliffe was found guilty on all 20 counts of murder and given 20 concurrent life sentences. The jury dismissed his claim of diminished responsibility, despite 4 psychiatrists diagnosing him as paranoid schizophrenia. The jury possibly dismissed the testimonies of the psychiatrist because a prison officer heard Peter say to his wife that if he convinced people he was mad, he might get 10 years in a loony bin. This case brought a lot of criticism to police at the time. Their inability to process information and link vital clues, their obsession with what turned out to be a hoax caller meant that they dismissed some forensic evidence. This hoax caller had a different accent, which is one of the reasons why they dismissed Peter as being a suspect. Also, their attitudes towards prostitutes at the time, and this was felt in statements and even in the court. If you look back at some of the things that were said, it makes me feel uneasy. A police statement regarding Peter said that Peter has made it clear he hates prostitutes. Many people do. We as a police force will continue to arrest prostitutes, but the Ripper is now killing innocent girls. That statement clearly shows how there was just this uncaring attitude towards the murder of prostitutes. Yeah, we hate them as well. Yeah, he kills them, but now he's killing innocent people. We're now going to look into it. And I think that's why Peter was not caught for such a long time, because his victims were people that just weren't seen as worthy of an investigation, basically. Even at the trial, the Attorney General states that some were prostitutes. Perhaps the saddest part of this case is that some were not. Surely each and every victim of Peter's is sad. These women were often forced into this trade. They had children, they were mothers. Cases where they weren't mothers and they were sex workers, these are still lives, these are still valuable, these are still people that deserve justice. Later on, author Chris Clark potentially links Sutcliffe to a further 20 murders. This includes a 14-year-old girl, Julia Roberts. Although he's found sane at trial, Peter is subsequently diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. When in prison, Peter is attacked several times. The first occasion is by a man called James Costello, who plunges a broken coffee jar twice into the left side of Peter's face. He's also attacked in Broadmoor by a man called Paul Wilson, who tries to strangle him. He's later attacked by a man called Ian Kay, who shoves a pen into his left eye. Peter actually loses sight in that one, and his right one is damaged. The final attack on Sutcliffe happened in 2007 by Patrick Sereda, who lunged at him with a metal cutlery knife, shouting, "You fucking raping, murdering bastard, I'll blind your fucking other one," aiming for his eye, but where Sutcliffe moved backwards, it ended up catching him on the cheek. Sonia, Peter's wife, seemingly had no knowledge of Peter's murders, and they subsequently divorced in the 90s. They separated a few years before that. She was hounded a lot after this case, and people were convinced that she knew more, or perhaps even was in on it. Peter Sutcliffe was never released, and he died aged 74 in November 2020. He had a lot of health issues, including obesity and diabetes. He had a private funeral ceremony and his body was cremated. That's the case of Peter Sutcliffe, or the Yorkshire Ripper. If you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe and comment, and I will see you in the next one.